Pat, it's Maximus here, this time with an Icon versus Icon. And no, I'm not going to test these till they break. But I did pick up the quarter inch and, and flex head as well as straight. I had done that review of the Icon 3/8 flex head and they had that recall. I did a video. I haven't heard anything back, so I think 30 days after that video, it'll be like a couple weeks, I'll do an update because there just has been no communication from Harbor Freight. Anyway, I picked up both of these ratchets because one of the common comments was that the straight handle ratchets just aren't of the same DNA as the flex heads are. And I went and picked these up, and at the end of this video, or about halfway through, I'll be doing a detailed breakdown on the inside, and there is huge differences. I'm not so hot to trot on the Icon flex heads at all. I would actually recommend you try to find another brand because the straight handles are really what you expect, and it looks like they're getting either more overhead or they're just being for some reason they're having to pay a lot more money for the flex head, and it has significantly reduced build quality. It is longer than the straight handle. They're both 90 tooth. The flex head does have a real nice light back drag, where on the straight handle it's actually pretty rigid. It's pretty stiff back drag on this, but it has a real solid ratchet mechanism, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The flex head I would recommend is these roto heads. I've already done a review and tear down one of these, and the ratchet mechanism is very large and heavy duty in the roto heads. But it seems these flex ratchets, and now it kind of makes me understand why they're having locking up issues on the 3/8, is the parts are a little undersized, and a lot of it's really subtle. One is the kind of the head design here. We can see where it's really square. It doesn't even look like the chrome is quite of the same grade. It just doesn't have quite exactly the same luster, like it's not quite as thickly plated on the flex head. We can also see how the straight handle is really nice and rounded, where it's just really sharp and square on the flex head. Another indicator of more quality is they have 90 tooth and do not immerse in fluids. Stamping those words on a metal plate costs money because you have another process, another stamp. They didn't do anything like that here. The flex head uses tiny little Torx T5s, and actually doing the breakdown, I was really gentle, but the screws were just not very deeply stamped, and I stripped out one. I might be able to get it back out, but it was really unfortunate. T5s are like a 2mm wide fastener on this flex head, and the screws are microscopic. Really kind of disappointed. They are still pretty small, but they're T6s, and they're just much higher quality, more deeply stamped screws on the straight handle. One thing I did find interesting is they did turn down the neck of the straight handle a little bit more on the flex head. But there could be different grades of materials. I don't know if these are really they may be coming out of the same factory, but it's more like the flex head is the mid-tier, and the straight handle really is a professional one. That's the best thing I can say now that I've been able to compare them both externally as well as internally, is that the Icon straight handles really are a nice ratchet. Really heavy duty, oversized ratchet mechanism. Even though it still has a cast zinc switch, there's a variety of differences. I didn't like the Icon 3/8, and just like on this quarter inch, because the switch is really high off. It's cast zinc, so it's not the most robust metal. Pretty thin profile, and since it doesn't have any support, that thing's gonna break. It's gonna fall on the ground. It's gonna be high up, and that thing is eventually gonna crack. It may bend some, but eventually you're gonna have issues with that. And somebody had posted I should get a straight handle because they are different, and it is true. The switch we can see is a larger diameter than it is on the flex head. If we look at just the thickness of the lever itself, we can see that it has a greater cross section than that does, both in width as well as overall thickness. We can see how thin it is on the flex head. We can see how thick it is on this one. But there's also an additional little gusset, so the amount of lever that's actually being unsupported is 50% less distance than it is on the flex head. This is definitely going to be much more robust, and I'm really kind of surprised about that. Even though this is cast zinc, there's very little that's actually overhanging, and that's going to take some bigger and more hits. And one other thing I'll mention here is that the anvil play, there's a little bit of play, but you can see it moving around on the flex head. Dang, this has a lot of back drag. You're really going to want to take it apart and squish the little spring for the ratchet pawl, because it's just way too strong. But as far as play, maybe I should do it this way because it might be better lighting. This thing is super tight. There's just a couple thousandths to play, what you really need, but really surprising. This is a really tight anvil. People who like tight anvils are going to like at least the 1/4 inch straight handle icon. Anyway, I always babble too much. Let's go ahead and cut to taking these down and evaluating them from the inside. And it's pretty dramatic. This ratchet is probably 50% stronger than this one is. Okay, now that we've got these taken apart, I'll first show the difference in the screws here. Those are the ones from the flex head. These are the ones from the straight handle. The screws are almost twice the size in the straight handle, and it's becoming obvious that the straight ratchet may be from a different supplier. It seems that with the flex heads, the additional expense of the flex, they went with a cheaper ratchet. And I will fully disassemble these. They both did have shim washers to try to help reduce a little bit of play, but there is no O-ring seals under the anvils. Here's what it looks like inside. We can see that there's a significant difference in the casting. The pawl is quite a bit larger in this one right here. And on this one, quite a bit shorter. Let's go and pull out both of those anvils here without getting everything to fall apart. This icon does have a little bit of light oil in it, the flex head did, where this one here actually had a little bit of grease. I've already had this apart, so it looks a little bit different. The first evidence that they are significantly different ratchets is the anvils. Here's the one out of the flex head, straight head, and the straight head, as we can see, is much wider. They're both 90-tooth ratchets. There's just a much more surface area. As we can see, it looks like it's, almost twice as much. It's really surprising. So quite a bit more engagement. That's going to be less likely to slip and is a stronger mechanism. I'm really pretty surprised about that. Now, if we take a look at the little pawls in here, here's our flex head pawl, and here's the one from the straight handle. These things are tiny. As we can see, the straight ratchet pawl is just huge compared to the flex head, and I'm really surprised because the flex head has a longer handle on it, but there's just no denying it. This ratchet mechanism is just heavier duty. It's going to take more load, and so I'm really liking the straight handle ones, and these flex heads really not so much. And I can see why they're having relative locking up issues in the 3/8 is probably because it's just a little bit too undersized. And I'm, wondering if they're just going to come out with the same ratchets, just with more oil in them, or maybe if they're going to actually change over to something like this. But the internals of the straight ratchet make the Icon Flex head look more like a Pittsburgh Pro. Really kind of surprising. Let's go and knock these switches out. And here we are, a much better look at those two switches. So the flex head and then the straight ratchet. There indeed is a little O-ring on the straight ratchet only, but not the flex head. Really, that's a pretty significant, you can just feel the weight. That's a light, flimsy thing. This thing probably weighs twice as much. So, having purchased one of these straight handle ones, I'll end up keeping this 1/4 inch because I do like to collect ratchets, at least the flex one, but I won't be buying any more Icon flex ratchets at all. If Harbor Freight comes through and does that replace or the bonus 3/8 ratchet that they're supposed to on the recall, of course I'll get that. But seeing the difference here, I really just don't see how there can be such a manufacturing cost increase on just the flex head that they would need to make it such a substantially lower quality ratchet. There's just a multitude of physical quality differences in just all the different components. This is the spring from the reverse lever detent, which has a little bearing ball on top of it. This is from the straight handle ratchet. This is from the flex head. It's just some tiny little thing where it's just a much more substantial, heavier coils on that little spring. It's like every part is just a much better ratchet. And so really, I think the Harbor Freight straight ratchets are actually really worth it, even if this has a bit of back drag. I'm sure, this spring right here for the pawl is actually pretty stout. and I may compress it just a little bit to ease it up. But this is definitely a heavy-duty ratchet with easily parts that are about as big as you can fit reasonably in a 1/4-inch ratchet. So I'm sure this is going to be as strong as pretty much anybody else out there. But this flex head, and this would be true for all the Icon flex heads except for the Rotos. That would be these. These have a really nice, really stout ratchet mechanism in them, and that would be the flex head that I would consider. And I would definitely pick up the straight handle. And on a final note here, to further add insult to injury, is there's another fundamental difference between the switches. The switch here on the flex head doesn't have any type of stop. The only thing that prevents that switch from flipping all the way around, totally upside down, is actually the little lever that's actually pushing on the back of the pawl back and forth. And that is actually a little piece of zinc. If you were to push that switch really hard or after enough cycles, this little thing is going to start wallowing out until it eventually breaks and your switch will just spin around. And the reason that's a big difference is on this switch, they actually have this little wing. I was wondering what it's for. Is actually a stop. It physically prevents the switch from over swinging and doesn't allow stress to actually build up on the actual part that is swinging the pawl back and forth. Although it's subtle, it actually shows a small detail that really is intended to allow this switch to be operated many more times, to go through far more cycles than one like this will. Anyway, I should also point out, I did just point out that this little one out of the flex has zinc. The little interaction button, or the little detent for that actually engages the ratchet pawl on the straight handle, is actually steel. So even, it's just surprising. There's like 10 or 15 different points here. I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.